Helena had always lived in the shadows of her husband's genius. Every day, she woke up to the quiet solitude of their home, making breakfast, caring for the kids, and maintaining the rhythm of a life that seemed to pass unnoticed. But in the corners of their house, in the dimly lit study where Moro spent most of his time, Helena found herself poring over his poems, carefully translating them into a language that spoke to her heart, words no one else would ever hear. For 13 years, she translated her husband's sorrow, his thoughts, and his delicate reflections on the world. She never once told anyone of the labor of love she devoted herself to. No one knew of the countless nights she stayed awake, meticulously crafting the words into another language, her own soul caught in the cadence of his grief. And then, one fateful day, the unexpected happened. A poem, one of Maro's most intimate reflections, was submitted to a renowned international poetry award by mistake by someone who had no idea who had written it, who had translated it, or the secret it held. The poem won. For the first time in their lives, both Mauro and Helena would find themselves on a path neither had expected, a path that would force Helena to confront the truth she had hidden for over a decade. Should she take credit for something she had always done in silence? Or should she remain in the background, watching as someone else took the glory for her work? This was the moment that would change everything for them both, and the beginning of a journey neither was ready for. The rain had been falling for hours. It wasn't the kind of rain that brought relief after a scorching day, but the kind that felt as though it had never really stopped, as though it was just waiting for an excuse to pour down and drown everything in its path. From the small window in the study, Helena watched the steady stream of water hitting the pavement, the rhythmic tapping of raindrops, a constant reminder of the stillness that filled their home. Inside, the warmth of the house was a contrast to the cold, damp world outside. She was sitting at her husband's old desk, the one that had been passed down from his father. It was cluttered with papers, half-filled coffee cups, and books that had long been forgotten. On top of the mess sat the leather-bound notebook, the one that Mauro had never let anyone see, the one filled with his thoughts, his dreams, and his words. For years, this notebook had been the source of both their quiet connection and the distance between them. Mauro, content to remain in the shadows of his mind, never once asked for his words to be shared. Helena, on the other hand, felt an unspoken desire to preserve them, to give them a voice beyond the confines of their home. She had spent the last 13 years translating his poems. A few years into their marriage, after she had learned enough about the intricacies of his poetry, she began to take on the labor of love. It wasn't something he had asked for. In fact, it was something he would have never allowed if he knew. But Helena couldn't stop herself. She loved his words, the way they spoke to her soul, the way they described emotions she hadn't known how to express. As she sat there now, she was deep in the translation of a poem that had haunted her for weeks. It was about a moment in Mauro's life that he had never shared with anyone. The poem described a time of profound loneliness, a period where he had questioned everything about himself. She had always known that Mauro struggled with self-doubt, but reading his words was like hearing his inner battle for the first time. The words hit her deeply. They made her feel more connected to him, more in tune with his unspoken pain, and, in a way, more isolated from the world around her. She could hear him in the next room, shuffling papers and muttering to himself, lost in his thoughts. He was a quiet man, withdrawn, introspective, but she knew there was so much more to him. He just couldn't bring himself to share it with anyone. Not with her, not with the world. Helena had learned to accept this over the years. She had learned to accept the quietness, the distance, the lack of recognition for the quiet work she did for him. The translations were hers alone, her secret, and they were enough for her. She never asked for praise. She didn't want recognition. What she wanted was to connect with him through his words. But she also couldn't deny that there was a part of her that longed for something more. She had always wondered what it would feel like for someone to notice her work, to acknowledge the quiet hours she spent behind the scenes, the sacrifices she had made. But this was a secret she carried with her, a burden she had grown used to. That night, as the storm raged on outside, Helena finished the translation. She closed the notebook, her fingers lingering on the leather cover. For a moment, she sat still, listening to the silence that enveloped her. It was strange how silence could be both comforting and suffocating at the same time. She glanced over at Mauro, who was still lost in his own world. He didn't know it, but in those pages, in her translations, she had given him a voice he never asked for. And though she could never tell him how much she longed for recognition, she knew that, in her own way, she had found a purpose in the quiet. But the truth would come out soon enough, in a way she never could have anticipated. Helena's world had always been small, quiet, predictable. She had never minded the simplicity of her life, at least not until recently. Mauro had always been content in his solitude, and she had grown to love the calm of their home. They had 2 children now, a boy and a girl, both growing older, both learning the importance of silence in a household that valued peace over everything else. Her days were filled with the mundane, the things that most people would overlook. Breakfast made with love, dishes washed, laundry folded, children's homework checked. She had become a master at navigating the small, repetitive tasks of life, never questioning whether there could be more to her existence. Her sense of self had always been tied to her family, to her husband's unspoken genius, and to the quiet support she gave without expectation. But as the years passed, something shifted. She found herself questioning the smallness of her life. The translations, her labor of love, had once been enough. But lately, she had started to wonder if she had a voice of her own, one that wasn't defined by her role as a wife, a mother, or a translator. She had begun to wonder if anyone, even Mauro, would ever know the true depth of her heart. It wasn't that she felt unappreciated. Mauro had always been loving, always attentive in his own way. But the truth was, he had never truly understood her sacrifices. He didn't know how much of herself she had poured into his work. He couldn't see it because to him, it was all about the poetry, the words that he poured onto the page. Helena had never been one to ask for acknowledgement. She had learned to live in the background, content with the love they shared. But deep down, she knew that there was a part of her that wanted more, a part of her that yearned for recognition. She wasn't sure why, but it had become an ache that she could no longer ignore. One evening, as she sat at her desk, her hands hovering over the keyboard, she heard Mauro's voice from the next room. He was on the phone, talking to a friend about his poetry. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the words caught her attention. "Maybe one day someone will notice," Mauro said. "Maybe one day they'll see what I've been trying to say all these years." Helena froze. For a moment, her heart stopped. She had never heard him speak like that before. His words hung in the air, laden with something she couldn't quite place. Desperation? Longing? Helena couldn't tell. But one thing was clear. He didn't know that someone had already noticed, that someone had been silently translating his words for years. The thought made her heart ache. She knew in that moment that everything was about to change, but she had no idea how. She had no idea that one of Mauro's poems, a secret she had kept hidden for so long, was about to become the key to a future neither of them could have imagined. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Helena was standing in the kitchen when the knock came. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of time when the sky had just begun to dim with the promise of night. She wiped her hands on a towel, assuming it was the neighbor or perhaps the delivery man with a package they hadn't been able to sign for earlier in the week. But when she opened the door, she was met with something entirely unexpected. A man dressed in a well-tailored suit stood at her doorstep, a briefcase in hand, his eyes sharp and focused. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying an air of authority. "I'm Thomas Grayson from the International Poetry Awards. I'm looking for Mr. Mauro Carvalho." Anna's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air for a moment before she found her voice. "Mahu? Ah, Mustari, may I?" Ask what this is about? I'm here to speak with him regarding an award his poem has won, Thomas said, his face unreadable. We'd like to offer him recognition for his contribution. The shock hit her like a wave, and for a brief moment she was frozen. Maro's poem? Winning an award? She couldn't have imagined such a thing, much less in a global competition. She had always been the only one who knew the truth behind his words, the only one who had nurtured them through the quiet hours of the night. Yet here was a stranger standing at her doorstep, bearing the news that someone else had found his words worthy of recognition. I'll go get him, Helena said, her voice barely above a whisper, a strange mixture of pride and apprehension welling up inside her. She went to the study, where Maro was hunched over his desk, scribbling notes, his usual quiet concentration broken only by the rhythmic tapping of his pen. She watched him for a moment, wondering if he could sense the shift in the air. The truth was, she didn't know how to tell him what was happening. The weight of the secret she had been carrying for so many years suddenly felt unbearable. Maro, she began softly, there's someone here to see you. He looked up at her, his expression curious but not entirely focused. Who is it? He asked, glancing back down at his papers. It's a man from the International Poetry Awards, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He says, one of your poems has won. His eyes narrowed in disbelief. My poem, he repeated, as if trying to process the words. I don't even send my work out. How could they know about me? Helena felt her pulse race. She could feel the moment teetering on the edge, about to spill into something neither of them could control. She wanted to explain the truth, to confess that it was her work, the translations she had spent years keeping in the dark. But she remained silent, watching as Maro stood up slowly, still unsure whether he should trust what he was hearing. I think you should meet him, she said gently, her voice almost pleading, as if by some miracle they could return to the comfort of their quiet life. But she knew that wasn't possible anymore. Not after this. Not after the world had suddenly noticed him, despite his wishes. Mauro followed Helena out of the study, his mind still clouded with confusion. The man from the International Poetry Awards, Thomas Grayson, stood waiting in the living room, his presence so formal it felt as though he didn't belong in their small, cozy home. He stood with a posture that screamed professional detachment, a contrast to the warmth of the surroundings. When he saw Mauro, his face lit up with a polite smile. Mr. Carvalho, it's a pleasure to finally meet you, Thomas said, extending a hand. I'm Thomas Grayson from the International Poetry Awards. It's about your poem, Echoes of the Forgotten. We'd like to award you the prize for outstanding international poetry this year. Mauro stood frozen, his mind racing. He didn't know whether to be elated, confused, or anxious. He had never submitted anything for publication, let alone a prestigious competition. His work was his own, personal and private. There had to be some mistake. He looked at Helena, seeking some kind of reassurance, but she remained silent, her eyes focused on the floor. Mauro stammered, his thoughts colliding. I didn't submit anything. I don't even know how this could have happened. Thomas tilted his head slightly, his expression one of understanding, but also professional distance. It seems that someone submitted your poem anonymously on your behalf, he explained. The poem was submitted under the name Anonymous, and after a review, it was selected as the winner. We've been trying to reach you for weeks, and we finally found your address. Helena felt a pang of guilt as she heard the words. She knew what had happened, but she didn't know how to confess. The secret she had kept for so long, the work she had done behind the scenes, had finally come to light. The truth that she had spent years translating Mauro's poetry without him ever knowing was now something neither of them could hide from. Mauro looked back at her, his expression one of confusion and a growing sense of realization. She couldn't look him in the eye. What could she say? How could she tell him now, after all this time, that the award-winning poem wasn't his alone? that his words were not only his, but hers too. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of everything she had kept secret pressing on her chest. She had always known this moment would come. She just hadn't imagined it would come so suddenly, so unexpectedly. And now, with the world outside pressing in, she was faced with a decision. Would she tell him the truth, or would she let the lie stand? Before she could say anything, Thomas handed Mauro a thick envelope. "This is the official recognition," he said. "We'll arrange the ceremony in a few weeks, but we needed to get in touch with you now so we could confirm the details." Helena watched as Mauro opened the envelope slowly, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a letter, embossed with the logo of the Poetry Awards, and a check for an amount that made her heart race. He looked up at her again, and for the first time, there was a question in his eyes. She knew it was time. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. The days following the visit from Thomas Grayson felt like a blur. The rain had stopped, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the house, hanging like a thick fog. Mauro, despite his initial shock, seemed oddly quiet, withdrawn even more than usual. Helena could see the questions in his eyes every time he glanced at her, but he didn't ask them. Not yet. They had always shared a silent understanding. They didn't need to speak all the time. Their lives had been built on this quiet rhythm, this constant, unspoken bond. But now, that rhythm felt shattered. She had never imagined that one small action, a translation, something she had done out of love and devotion, would create such a rift between them. The day after the visit, Mauro sat in his study as usual, the room filled with papers he never touched, the clutter of a life lived in the shadows of his mind. Helena was in the kitchen preparing dinner, her hands moving automatically, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she looked up, she saw him staring at the letter in his hands. The award letter, the acknowledgement he had never asked for. She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth, not yet. What could she say? The words seemed to twist in her throat. She had translated his words, had kept the secret for so long, and now it felt as though the world was watching her, waiting for her to finally speak. "Mauro?" she called softly, trying to find her voice again. She hadn't used his name like that in years. He didn't respond immediately, but after a few long seconds, he appeared in the doorway, his face still holding that confused, distant expression. "What is it?" he asked, though his eyes betrayed a deeper uncertainty. She stood still for a moment, unsure of what to say. How could she explain that she had given him everything, but in doing so, she had also robbed him of something? The chance to discover his own worth? To seek recognition in the way he had always feared? She stopped herself, her words stuck. "We need to talk." Mauro's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze steady. "About what?" Helena glanced toward the letter in his hands, the one that now seemed to hold the answers to everything they had kept hidden. "About the poem, about the award," she said quietly. She could feel the walls closing in again. The confession, so close, was nearly suffocating.
He looked down at the letter in his hand again, and there was a shift in his expression. For the first time since the visit, something softened in his eyes. He looked up at her, his voice low but earnest. "I don't understand, Helena. You said you didn't submit anything. So how did they get this?" The question hung in the air like a thread, pulling them both toward the truth. Helena had known this moment would come, the moment when he would ask her, when he would finally understand. And still, she hesitated. "I didn't submit it," she said slowly, her voice barely audible. "But I translated it, your poems, for years, without telling you." Mauro stared at her, blinking as though the words didn't make sense. "You translated my poems?" "Yes," she whispered. "All of them. Every single one. I've been doing it in secret. I wanted to preserve your words to make sure they weren't lost. But I never thought this would happen." Mauro's face shifted between confusion, disbelief, and something else. Something she couldn't place. "You've been translating my poems without telling me?" His voice was barely a whisper now. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Yes. I never asked for anything in return. I just wanted to help you. But I couldn't stop myself. I wanted the world to see what I saw in your work. There was a long silence as the weight of her words settled between them. Mauro looked down at the letter in his hands, his fingers curling around it, as if he were trying to make sense of what she had said. Helena felt her heart pounding, her breath shallow. She wanted to reach out, to explain, but she didn't know how. Finally, Mauro spoke, his voice raw with emotion. All these years, you kept this from me. I never knew. Helena swallowed, the guilt almost unbearable. I didn't want to burden you with it. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something, or that I was trying to take credit for your work. It was my way of showing you how much I believed in you, but now, everything's changed, hasn't it? He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the letter, his emotions a mixture of confusion, hurt, and something she couldn't read. It was a moment that changed everything, everything they had known, everything they had shared. And Helena realized for the first time that she had to let go of the quiet life she had built. The world had noticed Mauro, and now she had to face the reality of what that would mean for both of them. The next few days were filled with silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence they had once shared, the silence of two people who had learned to live in their own quiet rhythms. This was something different. The tension was palpable. Every conversation felt like an attempt to bridge an ever-widening gap. Mauro would disappear into his study for hours, his mind still trying to process everything that had happened. Helena found herself wandering the house aimlessly, unable to focus on anything. The translations she had worked so hard to keep hidden felt like an overwhelming weight now, a burden that had shifted the dynamics of their marriage forever. One evening, as Helena prepared dinner in the kitchen, she heard the sound of the front door opening. She glanced up to see Mauro stepping inside, a frown on his face. I spoke with Thomas Grayson today, Mauro said quietly, his voice distant. Helena's heart skipped a beat. And? She asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. She could hear the tremor in her voice. He wants to meet us in person, Mauro continued. They want to feature my poem in an exhibition, a global exhibition. His voice was tinged with a mixture of pride and reluctance. Helena's stomach tightened. The truth was coming at her faster than she had anticipated. And what do you want to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mauro paused before responding. I don't know. Part of me wants to tell the world that you were behind it, but the other part of me wants to let the world think it was all me. Maybe that's selfish. I don't know. Helena's heart ached as she heard his words. It wasn't about the recognition anymore. It was about something deeper, about the relationship they had built on quiet understanding, and now everything was on the verge of changing forever. Would their marriage survive this new reality? They both knew that something would have to give, but neither of them knew what that would be. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of urgency. Mauro had agreed to meet with Thomas Grayson for the exhibition, but every time Helena looked at him, she saw a man divided. He was no longer the same quiet poet she had married years ago. The recognition, the attention, had altered him in ways she wasn't sure how to process. His gaze had shifted from his inner world to the external one, as if the world's sudden acknowledgement of his work was too much, too soon. He had been so content in his solitude, so sure that his poems, his heart, belonged only to her. But now, everything was changing. It wasn't just about the poem anymore. It was about everything they had built, the unspoken understanding they shared. Everything felt like it was teetering on the edge, ready to collapse under the weight of the truth she had kept hidden. Helena couldn't help but feel the pull between wanting to remain silent and wanting to speak the truth. Should she reveal to the world that she had been the one to bring Mauro's poetry to life for so long? But what would it mean for their relationship? Could she live with the idea that everything she had done for him in secret might now be seen as a betrayal? She was still unsure whether her love for him had pushed her to do the right thing, or whether her silence was a form of sacrifice. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the air thick with the unspoken words between them, Mauro finally spoke up. "Helena, I've been thinking," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Maybe I've been too focused on the idea of what the world will think of me. Maybe I've been so obsessed with recognition that I've forgotten what matters most." Helena looked up at him, her heart fluttering. This was the moment. She could feel the shift, the beginning of something new. He wasn't just talking about the poem anymore. He was talking about their life, their love. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, that maybe it doesn't matter if the world knows about the poem," he said slowly. "Maybe what matters is that you believed in me all these years, that you saw something in my words before anyone else did. I've been so focused on the recognition, on the applause, that I've forgotten why I started writing in the first place." Helena's eyes filled with tears as she heard his words. The weight of her secret, the years of translating his poems, pouring herself into them, had created a rift between them that she hadn't fully understood until now. She had thought she was helping him, that her actions were a form of love. But in doing so, she had allowed him to become disconnected from the very thing that had driven him to write, his own inner truth. "I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I just wanted you to know that I believed in your words. In you." Mauro reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I know that now, but I also know that I've been hiding from my own truth. I've been so afraid to step into the light, to let anyone see me for who I really am, but maybe it's time I do." Helena squeezed his hand, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about their connection, their shared journey. They had both been hiding from something, but now they were ready to face it together. The world could recognize him all it wanted, but it was the love between them that had always mattered most. As Mauro prepared for the exhibition, the tension between them seemed to ease, but a new complication was forming in the background, one that neither of them could have predicted. The Poetry Award and the exhibition were drawing closer, and with it came a growing pressure to make decisions. What would they tell the world about Mauro's work? What role would Helena play in it all? And, perhaps most importantly, how would they handle the increasing attention that had begun to surround them? Helena had assumed that once the truth came to light, things would settle into a new rhythm. She had imagined that Mauro's recognition would be a moment of celebration, something they could both share. But as the days went by, it became clear that recognition had brought not just praise, but scrutiny. And with scrutiny came uncomfortable questions. The media began to reach out to them, asking for interviews, wanting to know more about the mysterious poet whose work had captured the world's attention. It seemed as though everyone wanted to know how such powerful words had come from a man so unknown. They wanted to know about Mauro's life, his inspiration, his process, but they didn't know the truth. That his poems had been hidden, nurtured by his wife's love and dedication. One evening, just days before the exhibition, a journalist from a prestigious literary magazine arrived unannounced at their door. She was polite but persistent, hoping to get an exclusive interview with Mauro. Helena felt her heart race as the woman's questions grew more pointed, more intrusive. "Mr. Carvalho," the journalist said, her voice all professionalism, "we've heard that your poems were submitted anonymously. Why did you decide to remain in the shadows for so long?" Mauro shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Helena. He had been honest with the media up until that point, but he hadn't told them about the translations. He hadn't shared the full story, and now it seemed impossible to keep it hidden any longer. Helena could feel the pressure building in the room. She knew this moment was coming. The moment when they would have to make a choice. Would they continue to let the world believe that Mauro's work had been created in isolation, or would they come clean about the truth of their collaboration? "I've never wanted the attention," Mauro said, his voice quiet but firm. "The poems were always for me. I didn't expect anyone to notice. But now that they have, I can't deny the reality of it." Helena's heart twisted. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to be truthful, but the truth was complicated. It wasn't just about his poems. It was about their marriage, their sacrifices, their hidden love. And the world was about to hear it all. "Mr. Carvalho," the journalist pressed, "you must have some personal connection to the poems. Were they inspired by a particular experience in your life?" Helena held her breath, her mind racing. This was the moment. She could no longer stay silent. "They were inspired by a lifetime of quiet moments," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Moments shared between two people who saw the world differently. My husband's words were always meant for me, and for him. The truth is, I've been translating his work for years. Without him knowing, I've helped bring his words to life. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. Mauro looked at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something that looked like gratitude, mixed with confusion. The journalist, sensing the moment's gravity, quietly excused herself, leaving them alone in the room. Helena and Mauro stood in silence, both unsure of what to say next. It felt as though the world had shifted beneath them. The truth had finally come out, and they both had to face the consequences. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. The next few days were filled with tension, but also a sense of inevitability. The truth was now out in the open. Mauro's poems hadn't been created in isolation. They had been brought to life through Helena's hands, through her quiet dedication. The revelation had come as a shock to him, but it also seemed to bring them closer. For the first time in years, they truly had to confront what their life had been, what it had become, and what it might be going forward. The media had picked up the story, and articles began to surface about the unseen collaborator behind Mauro Carvalho's poetry. Some readers hailed the bond between the two as a testament to unconditional love and artistic partnership, while others focused on the secrecy of the translation process, questioning whether it was ethical for Helena to hide behind her husband's name. Helena had been prepared for some backlash, but she hadn't anticipated the way it made her feel. She had spent her entire life hidden behind her husband's genius, her role always defined by her devotion to him. Now that the truth was out, she found herself questioning everything she had done. Was she a mere helper, a silent force behind the scenes, or had she been an artist in her own right? As they prepared for the upcoming exhibition, the couple found themselves in a constant state of flux. Mauro had agreed to attend the event, but there was a sense of discomfort in his demeanor. He had always been content with his quiet life, but now, with his work thrust into the public eye, he was filled with uncertainty. The recognition was overwhelming. He had never wanted the spotlight, but now it was unavoidable. One evening, the two of them sat in the living room, the soft hum of the television playing in the background. Mauro looked up from the article he was reading, his brow furrowed. "Helena, do you think I've betrayed my work by letting this happen? By letting the world see it like this?" Helena felt her stomach churn. It was the question that had been hanging between them ever since the truth had come out. Would the world see him as a fraud? Would he ever be able to reconcile the attention with his deeply private nature? "I don't think it's betrayal," Helena said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "You've always been true to yourself. You've written your words, your truth. But I translated them because I saw something in them. I saw the beauty you didn't want anyone to see, and I thought it was worth sharing. I thought your words could touch the world." Mauro sighed, rubbing his eyes as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "But now everyone knows the truth, that they were mine only because of you. What does that say about my poetry?" Helena moved closer, her hand gently resting on his. "It says that your poetry is more than just words. It says that you've inspired someone to believe in you, to take your private thoughts and make them something greater. It's a testament to what you've done. It's a reflection of the power of your words, not just their content." Mauro looked at her, his gaze softening as he reached for her hand. "And what about you, Helena? What does it say about you?" Helena met his eyes, the depth of her emotions making her voice tremble. "It says that sometimes love isn't about being seen. Sometimes love is about supporting someone, even when no one else knows. It says that we did this together, even if no one ever acknowledged it." The room was silent for a long while. It wasn't a resolution, but it was an understanding. They both knew that the future held more questions, more decisions to be made. But for the first time, they had faced the truth together. And that was a beginning. The night of the exhibition arrived, and with it came a storm of emotions. As Helena and Mauro stepped into the gallery, the crowd of poets, journalists, and art enthusiasts felt like a world entirely separate from their quiet life. The lights above cast an almost surreal glow on the space, turning the simple black and white photographs of poets and their words into something elevated, something unattainable. Helena could feel the tightness in her chest as she walked beside Mauro. He had agreed to come, but it was clear that this world, the world of fame and recognition, was one he wasn't ready for. It was all too much, too fast, He had always believed in the quiet power of his words, in the sanctuary of his home, and now, suddenly, his poetry was being showcased for all to see. They were escorted to a private area, where the other honorees were gathered. It was here that Helena felt the weight of everything settle in. She hadn't expected the attention, hadn't expected the whispers from the crowd, the curious gazes from strangers. Her role, once so secret, was now laid bare. And she felt exposed. As they were seated, a representative of the Poetry Awards walked up to them, a warm smile on her face. "Mr. Carvalho, Mrs. Carvalho, it's such a pleasure to have you here tonight. Your poem is truly a masterpiece." Mauro nodded, a small, polite smile tugging at his lips, but his eyes were distant. "Thank you," he said quietly, almost as though he were reciting words he had said many times before. Helena squeezed his hand under the table, giving him a reassuring smile. She could see the weight of the moment on his face, but she knew he was trying. He had never asked for this, never imagined his words would be displayed like this for the world to see. The truth. The truth that she had spent years translating his work, bringing it to life, now felt like both a gift and a burden. The evening unfolded with speeches, performances, and awards, but Helena couldn't shake the sense that she was standing at the precipice of something monumental. This moment, this recognition, was the culmination of everything they had done together, everything they had built in silence. And yet, despite the applause and the admiration from the crowd, there was a part of her that felt disconnected from it all. As the night wore on, the ceremony finally reached its peak. Mauro was called to the stage to accept his award. When he stood, there was a sense of finality to it. His name was announced, and the applause filled the room. But as he walked toward the podium, he paused for a moment, looking at Helena. Their eyes locked, and for the first time since the whole event began, she saw something new in him. Acceptance. He had embraced the truth of his words, his poems, and their shared journey. He stepped to the microphone, cleared his throat, and in a voice filled with both humility and strength, he spoke. "I want to thank you all for this incredible honor," he began, his voice steady. "But I must also acknowledge something important. I didn't write these words alone. My wife, Helena, has been the one who brought my poetry to life, who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here tonight." Helena felt her breath catch in her throat, the weight of his words sinking in. She hadn't expected him to speak out, hadn't expected him to give her credit in front of the world. But here he was, doing exactly that, and in that moment, everything changed. Mauro smiled at her from the stage, and the world around them seemed to fade. It wasn't just about the award, or the recognition, or even the poetry. It was about their connection, the quiet, enduring bond that had always been at the heart of everything they had built. They had stepped into the light together. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. The weeks following the exhibition were both exhilarating and exhausting for Helena and Mauro. The world was suddenly paying attention to them in ways neither had ever imagined. Interviews, book signings, even a documentary crew who wanted to follow Mauro as he navigated this newfound fame. Everything felt like it was spinning too fast. Mauro, despite the praise, began to pull away again. The quiet, introspective man she had married seemed lost in the glare of the spotlight. Helena watched him as he sank deeper into himself, retreating into the study, leaving her to navigate the chaos of their lives. She understood his discomfort, but it felt as if the distance between them was growing again. Their house, once their sanctuary, now felt like a cage, full of strangers calling at all hours and journalists knocking at their door. The house had become a hub for the media, and they both felt trapped in it. One evening, Helena found herself sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers running over the worn edge of the wooden surface. She hadn't seen Mauro all afternoon. She could hear the distant hum of the television, but he was nowhere to be found. There was a gnawing sense of unease building in her chest, a sense that something important was slipping away. Just as she was about to go upstairs to find him, the doorbell rang. She walked to the front door, expecting another reporter, but instead, it was a package. It was from the Poetry Awards, a letter confirming Mauro's invitation to a prestigious literary gathering in New York. The letter held an invitation for both of them to attend, the official award ceremony where Mauro was expected to give a speech and, most importantly, accept another high-profile award for his poem. The words were a blur as Helena stared at the letter, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. This would be the event that solidified his fame, and yet it felt like it would tear them apart. When Mauro finally came downstairs, he was dressed in a way he hadn't been in weeks. His clothes a reflection of the man he once was, the reclusive poet who never cared for recognition. Helena could see it in his eyes. He was still lost, struggling to reconcile the man he had always been with the person he was now expected to be. She handed him the letter, and as he read it, his expression remained unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I don't want to go," he said, his voice barely audible. Helena blinked, surprised. "What do you mean? This is your moment. You've worked for this your whole life." "I didn't work for this," Mauro said sharply. "I never wanted it. I wanted my words to be mine, not something to be dissected by the world. It's too much. I didn't sign up for this." Helena felt a rush of emotions. She understood his pain, but she also knew that this was a chance for him to embrace something he had never allowed himself to have: recognition. The world had already seen him, and now they were asking him to accept that truth. "I know it's hard, but it's happening whether we want it to or not," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "We can't run away from it, Mauro. This is your work. You can't hide from it anymore." Mauro's eyes darkened, and for a moment, it felt like they were worlds apart again. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't recognize myself in all of this. You were the one who made this happen, but now it feels like it's taking me somewhere I don't want to go." Helena stood there, feeling the weight of the words hang in the air. She knew that this wasn't just about fame or poetry. It was about identity, about who they had become. They had spent so long in the shadows that stepping into the light felt like an impossible challenge for them both. "I just want to go back to the way things were," Mauro said quietly, his voice cracking. "Before all of this, before the world knew me." Helena's heart ached as she looked at him. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't change the path they were on, but she also couldn't ignore how much it was costing him. And it was costing her, too. In that moment, Helena realized that no matter how much she loved him, she couldn't carry the weight of this alone anymore. They had to decide together what kind of life they wanted to lead moving forward. And she couldn't make that decision for him. The days leading up to the literary event were filled with a quiet unease. Despite his earlier resistance, Mauro had reluctantly agreed to attend the award ceremony in New York. The decision was made not out of excitement or pride, but out of a sense of obligation, a responsibility to himself, to the words that had made him who he was, and to Helena, who had supported him through it all. Helena watched him as he packed his things, his movements mechanical, almost as though he were going through the motions without truly being present. She knew how much this event meant to him, how conflicted he felt about the whole situation. But she also knew that this was the turning point for both of them, the moment they would have to choose what kind of life they would lead moving forward. The night before they were to leave for New York, they sat together in the living room, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their home. For the first time in weeks, the noise from the outside world seemed to fade away, and there was a peaceful stillness between them. "Mauro," Helena began softly, her voice steady, "I know this is hard. I know this isn't what you wanted, and I know it's not the life we planned. But we have to face it. We've been given this opportunity, and we can't ignore it, but it doesn't have to change who we are." Mauro sat across from her, his face weary, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't want to change. I never wanted any of this." Helena reached out, her hand brushing his. "I know you didn't, but the truth is, you've already changed. We've both changed, and that's okay. Change doesn't always mean losing who you were. It just means growing into something new." He met her gaze, his eyes searching for the certainty he had lost somewhere along the way. "What if I don't like the person I've become? What if this recognition changes everything between us?" Helena took a deep breath, her words coming from the heart. "Mauro, you are still the man I married, the man who wrote those poems, but you're also someone who's allowed the world to see him. And that's okay. We've always been in this together, and we'll face whatever comes next together. We don't have to know everything right now. All we can do is take it one step at a time." Mauro looked at her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Helena. I don't think I would have been able to do any of this without you by my side." Helena smiled back, feeling the weight in her chest lift just a little. It wasn't all figured out, and it probably never would be, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. They were facing the future together, no matter how uncertain it seemed. The next morning, as they boarded the plane to New York, they didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. New York was a whirlwind. The city's lights, its pulse, the constant movement, it felt both exciting and suffocating. Helena and Mauro arrived at the hotel, but the world around them was so loud, so fast, that it almost drowned out the quiet moment they needed. The constant buzz of reporters, photographers, and fellow poets seemed to follow them at every turn. Helena could see it in Mauro's eyes. He was overwhelmed. The man who had once been content in his quiet, peaceful life now found himself standing on the precipice of something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Yet, they were here. They had made it, together. The morning of the ceremony, the city felt different. There was a tension in the air, something both thrilling and terrifying. Mauro was quiet as he dressed, adjusting his suit jacket with the precision of someone trying to keep his anxiety at bay. Helena stood in front of him, watching him as he ran his hands over the fabric, smoothing out every imperfection, as though he could control the chaos around him by perfecting the smallest details. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Mauro didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked at her, and for a moment the world outside seemed to disappear. His eyes were full of emotion, fear, doubt, but also gratitude. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. "I never wanted this. I wanted my words, my poems to stay mine, but now they're part of something bigger. I don't know if I can handle this, the attention, the expectations. It feels like I'm being swallowed by it." Helena stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Mauro," she began, her voice soft but firm, "it's okay to be scared. But you don't have to do this alone. We've been through so much together. This recognition, this moment, it's just the beginning. It doesn't change who we are or what we've built together. It just means that your words have found a place in the world." He nodded slowly, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Helena smiled, feeling a wave of warmth wash over her. "You don't have to. I'll always be here. And no matter what happens tonight, no matter where we go from here, we'll be together. We've always been in this together." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had experienced settling around them. The world outside was waiting, but in that small hotel room, it was just the two of them, their connection, their shared journey, everything they had built. When they arrived at the venue, the grand hall was everything they had imagined, and more. The room was filled with famous poets, critics, and artists. The stage was set, the spotlight waiting for its next star. As they walked in, Helena could feel the intensity of the room. It was a world of its own, one that seemed to separate her and Mauro from everything they had known. Yet she could feel him, standing a little taller, his shoulders straighter, as though he was beginning to embrace the enormity of the moment. Mauro was called to the stage to give his acceptance speech. He stood at the podium looking out at the sea of faces, each one expectant, waiting for him to speak. For a moment his gaze flickered toward Helena, and in that moment everything seemed to still. The noise of the room faded. It was just the two of them, standing there, at the crossroads of everything that had brought them to this point. Mauro took a deep breath and began. "This is an honor I never expected. To have my words heard by so many, to be recognized in this way, is something I've never sought. My poetry has always been my personal reflection, a part of my soul that I've kept hidden. But it wasn't just my voice in these words. It was the quiet, steadfast belief of someone who has always been there. My wife, Helena." There was a pause in the room, a collective breath held as the audience processed his words. "Mauro," Helena whispered under her breath, the words almost too quiet for him to hear. But they both understood. He was saying what had never been said before. He was acknowledging her place in his life, in his art. "I've written many poems," Mauro continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "But none of them would have been possible without her. Without the quiet, loving support she's given me. Without her belief in me, when I couldn't see it myself." Helena felt tears prick her eyes as she stood in the audience, watching him. This wasn't just an acceptance speech. This was a declaration, a public recognition of everything they had been through, everything they had shared. Mauro wasn't just accepting the award, he was accepting his own vulnerability, his truth, and the love that had always been there, quietly shaping his words. The room erupted into applause, but Helena didn't hear it. She was still lost in the moment, in the way he had finally allowed himself to be seen, to be recognized, not just for his poems, but for the journey they had taken together. As the night drew to a close, the weight of everything they had just experienced began to sink in. The applause, the interviews, the flashing cameras, they all felt so far removed from the quiet world they had once known. Yet, there was something liberating about it now, something that felt right. Mauro and Helena walked through the streets of New York, hand in hand, the cool night air brushing against their skin. The city was alive with energy, but for them, it felt like a different kind of life. It wasn't the life they had planned, but it was a life they were ready to embrace. "We did it," Helena said, breaking the silence between them. "We made it through." Mauro smiled, his face finally relaxed, the tension that had gripped him for so long fading into the night. "We did," he said softly, "and it feels strange, but good. I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to be seen, not just for my work, but for who I am." Helena squeezed his hand. "It's not just about being seen, Mauro. It's about being true to yourself. And you've done that, every step of the way." They stopped walking, looking out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars. For the first time in a long time, everything felt possible. "We've come a long way," Mauro said, his voice full of reflection. "And there's still so much more to go. But whatever happens, I know we'll face it together." Helena smiled, her heart full of quiet joy. "Together," she echoed, the word carrying with it all the weight of their shared journey, their struggles and their triumphs. As they stood there, watching the city below, it was clear that their story was far from over. This new chapter, one they would write together, was just beginning. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they could face them, side by side. End of story.